All right.
Okay.
Graffiti. Yeah, it's about time.
Good morning, everybody. Warren has started the blue sheets in their journey around the room. We'll be starting the session in a couple of minutes, waiting for a few more people to find their way in. Thanks. Because everybody else is. See, in this room, we always have plenty of chairs. Most of them are out there. Hey, I love mics. Of course we know what we should do. We're just vamping. All right, we can give it to 5 after.
Not too high for you? Maybe I can put it back.
Yeah, you
I will put it back. This is better. Okay, I will put it back.
you can adjust it as
Yeah,
needed.
it's easy. It's just this one. But I
am much smaller.
will. You only realize when you're standing behind the mic. I think we can start.
Sure.
Yeah? Good morning, everyone. DNSOP session 2 this week. Let's get me the clicker. It's the standard procedure here. I'm Benno, Suzanne over there, Tim is in the room. These are the chairs. Warren, our AD. Dan is our jabber for this morning session. And Paul. Yeah, excellent. Thank you. Paul is the scribe. The minutes taker. Please state your name at the microphone. Show your tag to Paul if you ask for it. Good. The note well. Take care of that. Everybody notes the note well. Blue sheets. Please fill in the blue sheets. It's a good crowd. We want to have this kind of size wall. But a little bit, we could do with half of the size of the room, but we definitely want large rooms next time again. So fill in the blue sheets. The agenda for today. Normally, Tim takes care of the nice pictures. I was not that inspired I do the towing car. So one thing people say, well, you bring too much work into the working group. So towing into the working group, but also we want to move further with the A name. We added it yesterday, actually, on the agenda, and move it again ahead. So that's the team, towing car. New work. This session primarily is about new work. So there's 4 presentations, 2 presentations on new work, 3 presentations on new work, 1 presentation by Stephen about other working group activities outside the DNSOP, but should be mentioned over here. Our work is on data tracker and on GitHub. So we try to be as transparent as possible. Please talk to us if we aren't. Some other thing I should mention, Tim told me, but actually I should have come to the conclusion myself, is yesterday there was a POM award by some of our colleagues in the room. And it was the best data set award on QName minimization collection. And short message is nothing to worry, all good. So QName is great. It's good for the working group to know that we are doing work that makes sense here. I think this is the agenda. It's also on data tracker. I don't have to go through the different items here. We end with the A name discussion. We have 5 minutes. I think we can get started. Giovanni, can you? Thank you. Any other questions about agenda, actually? We call it agenda restructuring. No? Okay, thank you. Here's the clicker. I will switch slides not in a minute, but in a couple of seconds.
Sure. Hi. So, good morning, everybody. Thanks for being here so early this morning. Last day of IETF. I think they try to keep all the DNS folks for the last day. You have 2 sessions today. All right, so here we go. First time we presented this draft here at IETF. It's version number 3 already. This is an informational draft. Yeah, I have a screen here. I have put here the list, the links for the versions I have sent to the list, so whether responses or not. We are doing this draft on the GitHub. And also the DNSOP chairs have asked us to try to get feedback from other sources and other operators, and I did that, and there's a link there for the discussion OARC list. All right, so this draft, it's like the product of work of 13 researchers that have been doing, we have been doing a bunch of research papers on DNS over the last 3-4 years. And what we have done is get those papers and try to find recommendations, get the recommendations for operators, DNS operators. There were like 4 IMC papers, 1 PAM, which is the conference that just happened, by the way, but that paper's not here. The problem with papers for operators are they tend to be long, it take a lot of time, and I see that at .NL. Folks at the SIDN, they like the papers, but sometimes they don't have the time to read that. So our idea is to get these papers, put it on a list, iterate through the list, and apply a too long to read filter on that, and just print the recommendations. So that's exactly what the ops folks asked at the company, and the SIDN said, all right, let's do this. Try to have tangible direct recommendations. And if those recommendations are backed by measurements, if you want to know why we pointed to the papers there. So the target group here is large authoritative DNS operators with global traffic. Like I have my own personal domain. I don't need to follow the recommendations on this draft for my domain that gets no traffic at all. So this is the recommendations in a nutshell. We have 6 of those here. And these are the reference papers here. And I'll be going through each of them now. The first recommendation states that you should use equally strong IP Anycast in every authoritative server. That means NS record, by the way, to achieve like sort of an even load distribution. So the recommendation derives from the fact that a resolver, we did a measurement paper on that, and if you have for a certain zone 4, 5, whatever authoritative name servers, NS records, resolvers will get to choose which one they're going to send the queries to, but they're going to send queries to all of them, and regardless of the round trip time between the resolver and the authoritative. Closer resolvers would get more traffic. So for ops, that means that, all right, so if you have like multiple authoritatives, you have to optimize sort all of them. They all have to deliver good latest for your global clients. And by definition, Unicast can't do that. A client in California will always have longer latency to authoritative Unicast server located in Europe or Japan because it's a geographical distance. So this paper, recommendation number 1, recommended using Anycast and our authoritative name servers, all your NS records, and have like strongly here, Anycast means like in terms of peering and capacity, and phase out Unicast. And we have deployed that, not me, my colleagues as operations team at .NL, they have deployed that at .NL. We used to have 7 authoritative name servers, a mix of Anycast and Unicast, and now we have only 4 Anycasts. Recommendation number 2, routing can matter more than location. So this is the case when folks are gonna hire or engineer authoritative name servers, and there's also sort of assumption that if you have more sites, more instances, more locations, you're gonna have lower latency. So paper number 2 here showed that's not always the case. This was this analysis that they have done with RIPE Atlas, and they measured the median latency to different root server ladders. And you see the size of those deployments, like root has 144 sites around instances around the time, and root had 8, and they all deliver similar median latency values between 30 and 32 milliseconds for all these RIPE Atlas probes. So in other words, when choosing that, you have to be careful, not only consider the number of sites, but also the peering and location where they're actually located. And why this happens? Because BGP is agnostic to geographical distance. So the recommendation number 2 here suggests that you should consider routing and connectivity also when engineering DNS and ECAS services. They've also found that 12 sites exclude and offer global latency, but if you really want to have more to engineer for DDoS attacks. Recommendation number 3, this refers to FireFlutter and refers to collecting Anycast, detailed Anycast catchment maps ahead of actual deployment can improve engineering designs. So let's say you have run one authoritative name server with 5 instances. You want to add a new site in LAX. It's very hard to know what's going to happen with the traffic, how your traffic is going to shift once you've announced the new site in Los Angeles, for example. So one way to go about that is use a recommendation that we have in this paper number 3. The authors have developed, I was not involved in the study, but my colleagues were, to use FireFlutter. There's a ICMP-based tool that maps the catchments on the internet. Sorry, I don't have the time to cover all the things here, but you can even use that before deployment on a new prefix that you're going to deploy Anycast, or on a prefix that you announce for the same locations but not in your production network, and you can actually predict the catchment and the query distribution. They run that on Beirut. When Beirut went from Unicast to Anycast, and it predict very precisely how would be the load query distribution to the LAX site. You can see that when 1.6 was predicted, 81.4 was the load that was observed in percentage in LAX. And this tool has been deployed on Anycast testbed. That's a testbed that we have. We do a bunch of tests there at Beirut and a large unnamed operator as well. All right, recommendation number 4. When under stress, we should recommend that you employ 2 strategies. So let's say here you have your Anycast name server with these sites here, those locations actually, and there's a DDoS attack. So what's going to happen that BGP is going to map this attack, which are like IP addresses, to different sites. And let's see, BGP would give you the distribution. You kind of have no control over that. It depends on the BGP map in your upstream provider, the client source of attacks. And in this particular example here, one thing you can do is, if your LAX site is big enough, you can say, well, let this one burn. Let's one try to handle the traffic, and the other clients here are going to be fine. So one strategy during the DOS is do nothing and let LAX site, which is taking 50% of the attack, become a degraded absorber. Clients going there are probably going to have problems trying to get an answer, but the others are going to be fine. Another thing you can do is do a bunch of manipulations on routing. You can like prepend routes, withdraw routes, announce new sites, BGP black holing, in an attempt to shift the traffic into a distribution of queries that matches your capacity, the capacity of your sites, your locations. And the thing is, the best option depends on the attack itself and your infrastructure specifics as well. So that's the summary. So two strategies. Either do nothing and allow the website to burn and become like absorber, or withdraw and try to shift the traffic. We actually have a new project working specifically on that to try to figure out how we can actually do this better. TTLs. Recommendation number 5 suggests you should consider using longer TTL values for DNS records whenever possible. TTLs, they set like term limits or how long queries should remain in resolver's cache. It's a sort of ephemeral replication for the zone file. Anyway, study number 5 emulates DDoS attacks with various different packet losses. We gotta use IP tables to draw packets of those losses. And this figure here shows, blue here, our clients get an answer. And the arrow going down around 10 minutes here shows when the emulated DDoS attack started. And you see here that these are the phases that only cache was working if you would get an answer. You cannot get from the authoritative servers anymore because they were down for this experiment. And you see here people get an answer from the cache. But once the cache expires, nobody gets an answer. Only like people who have served stale. So caching is very important. It's a key component of DNS resilience. And TTL is highly correlated to that. The authorities have the power to say how long it's going to be in the cache, therefore how long clients can resolve the domain in the unlikely event or the event of unavailability of these authoritative servers. So caching is a key component. Resolver will do their job trying to resolve the domain. They're going to try to switch from server to server, even if that means like hammer the authoritative servers, even when they're under DDoS attacks. So recommendation number 5 is like use longer TTLs whenever possible. But of course, there's no one-size-fits-all solution here. We're actually working on a new measurement paper for the next conference, measurement conference, that exactly works on trying to figure out a better way to recommend TTLs. All right. Recommendation number 6, share infrastructure risks collateral damage during attacks. So you got to be careful when you engineer DNS services. Co-location implies you share some parts of the infrastructure. On the study number 4, we found that when the routes were attacked back in 2015, some .NL sites co-located, or they had some sort of a shared infrastructure. They also suffered, observed higher rates of packet loss on .NL, even though .NL was not attacked. And the DINE 2016 attack showed similar results. Multiple zones were partially reachable when the DNS were attacked. So the conclusion and recommendations are like, you gotta be aware of shared infrastructure risks. Like if you share infrastructure, you're gonna be running that risk. Of course, there's economics in here involved as well. Sharing is cheaper usually, but you gotta be aware of that. So that's what I have to say. Here's a list of recommendations. I would like to thank all the reviewers, and I'll be happy to take any questions.
Hi, George Michelson, APNIC. Could you please go back to slide 8?
Yeah.
8,000 Atlas probes is basically most of the Atlas network, isn't it?
Yes.
So this is not a distance equalized distribution of probes. 5,000 of those probes are in Europe. 5,000 of those probes are one hop from DKIX or AM6 or links, where there will be Anycast instances of these routes. So in the statistical distribution of the average latency, the RTT, most of the European nodes are a low RTT from a route. But if you are in South America or Japan or Korea or Africa, these figures would not happen. I don't think statistically your median RTT figure matches the reality of the different distributions of these routes.
So yeah, thanks for your comment. I was not personally involved in the study. Some of my co-authors were. So this is RIPE Atlas, and I'm not sure which year they ran that, but we all know that RIPE has some sort of bias towards Europe. That's a fact.
Right, but you're using this as a justification for routing over location density in the routes and saying there's an equivalence between their distribution. I don't think this is plausible.
Okay, Wes?
So sorry, co-author Wes Hardiker, ISI. Real quick point that I think we could get into the technical details of each of the studies in here, and I think from the perspective of today, it would be best to decide two things. One, is the draft worth pushing forward in the IETF, and two, right, which academic papers are worth like keeping in the draft as a recommendation. And maybe we throw some out. Maybe somebody has some more that we can add in. this was an academic peer-reviewed paper, so we could have a whole discussion on the merits of the paper, but I think that's out of scope. Does that make sense? But not wanting it in is perfectly in scope.
Yeah, I agree. As a chair, I think this discussion is very good. Bring the operations also.
Yeah.
Well, read the document, give feedback to Geo.
Yeah, okay, thanks.
Lars Lehmann, NetNode, the second operator to employ Anycast more than 15 years ago.
Oh.
My first question would be, what's your planned future for this document? What would you like to see it become?
So this is information, a draft. If it gets adopted to the working group, would like to become a recommendation RFC. Yeah.
Recommendation or
It's for operators.
Pardon?
For authoritative servers operators.
But informational is the goal, not BCP.
No, not
Okay.
BCP. No.
Perfect. I like the things that you observe in this document, but I would very, very strongly recommend against calling them recommendations. Observations, fine. Suggestions, so things to think about, fine. Don't make them recommendations, because there are so many different things going on out there on the network that if you start to recommend things going in one direction in a document that carries the stamp RFC, you will shift the entire DNS business into going that way, because the customers will point to this document and say, we must have this. And when you do that, you take away all the diversity that we have today. And that diversity is a very good balance. I'm somewhat averse to the comparison you did between Unicast and Anycast, because I think there's lots of stuff in there, but you make correct observations. But I'm very averse to calling them, to shift that into recommendations. So if you change the entire tone of the document into these are things we have observed, and these are things you need to think about when you deal with in the relationship with Anycast operators and so on, I would happily support it. But in the current tone that you have, I will not support this document.
All right. Thanks for your feedback. I think observation. So our idea for this document is like in the papers we observe a bunch of behaviors, and we wrote in the papers recommendations derived from those observations. Each of them, they are backed by large-scale measurements, so I think it would be. I'm not positive. I'm not so sure about changing the term because, well, the observations are in the papers themselves. But yeah, I can have a discussion about that.
Right.
But
what you're doing is that your recommendations, and these are 5 people recommendations to the entire DNS community. I'm sorry. And
no, I mean, but I have
you want to
data.
carry the weight
data.
of the IETF and the RFC stamp on that. And sorry, I'm not buying into that.
No, that's fine. I mean, we have data, you have papers. I would recommend you to read the papers too.
Yeah, but I don't want people to do it in one and the same way.
No, I'm not saying
there to be
everybody.
multiple parts, and I want this to be observations on things that play into role.
I
And
think you guys are in violent agreement.
No, we're
No, we agree.
we're in a harmonic disagreement.
Let me. I think
Wes Herdiger. Hi,
we do
Lehman.
have to keep the queue moving, and I'm going to close. Excuse me. Point
Sorry.
of order. We're going to close the queue after Peter. Thank
So I think that's a valid thing, and I do think that we need to take that back and think about it.
Okay.
I don't think observation is the right word either, but let's not wordsmith now.
Yeah. All right.
I'm fine with that.
Stefan Bertsmeyer. I have a hat. I work for a CCTLD operator. I already told you that it was a great research, so thank you for everything and the recommendations, advice, suggestions, etc. One concern is I think it was already recorded as an issue on your draft. It's not for authoritative name server operators. It's for very big authoritative name server operator. So people may, large, exactly. The title on the introduction of the draft today does not reflect this. So people who manage a small zone or a small, not so small actually, may don't see what's the point. And for these people, there are a lot of recommendations too, such as several DNS providers, NoSPOF, etc. So I suggest a title on presentation of the draft that would make clear that the scope is much more narrow.
Yeah. So you're right. I mean, when I first submitted the first version, most of the comments we got was like, can you specify what's your target audience? So we did that in the document, but we did not reflect that in the title. So we should have that. Thanks. great observation.
Hello, Peter van Dijk, Power DNS. Can I see slide 13?
Yep. Yes.
So it's obvious that at the beginning you have 100% cached and after an hour you have 0, but the distribution over that hour looks very weird to me. Would expect a sharper drop-off. Can you explain that?
So hang on. So where exactly? Which minute you're talking?
Like at 30 minutes, I would expect it to be closer to half.
So this is this experiment. We had a TTL of 1 hour. So we allow all the probes, all the resolvers to run, send the first queries with no problems at all. And then the time equals to 9, we start to drop 100% of the packets.
Okay, so you started to drop pretty quickly after getting the packet into the cache.
There are many more experiments in the paper. We vary when it starts to drop and vary the TTLs, but this was just the easiest to show here. And what happens is like here, you see like this is the time that the TTL was still valid. And then you see like here, a lot of people start to expire, and then here, everybody expired, except for those who serve stale content.
Right, so in a real world situation, you would see more records go away earlier.
If you would, that's a function as well.
They might have been in cache for longer when the exec starts. Okay,
yeah, so the resilience in regards to cache depends when the actual record was fetched and not only the TTL, if that's what you mean.
Yes.
Yeah, perfect. Yeah, absolutely.
Joe Abley, PIR. I like the idea of this, and I've actually read 4 of these papers.
Oh, thanks.
Which is surprising. So I've got a couple of observations, though. One of them is that none of these papers taken as a group are really about Anycast, not about DNS. Oh. I mean, I know that they used services that are deployed using Anycast in order to make measurements, and those happen to be DNS services. But the papers themselves are not really about the DNS, with the possible exception of this TTL one. But to be honest, this is one I haven't read, and perhaps I won't, because it seems to say that when things expire, they expire, which I think you know. Just hang on a sec. So if we think of it as just an Anycast collection of papers, and appreciating that it's a nice idea to take these academic insights and actually produce them something operational from them, the problem that I have with this draft, aside from the topic matter, is that I think the papers that I've read had quite nuanced and subtle conclusions that were very, very carefully framed. They didn't make general observations across the entire system because they were actually good papers, and they made very specific observations that you have to understand in the context of the measurement. They didn't make very broad claims. However, this document does make very broad claims. And I think you've drawn recommendations that are overly broad given the justification of the measurement. And I don't think it's sensible to say this recommendation, advice, suggestion, whatever, is justifiable because there was measurement. If you look at the measurement's actually looking at something very, very narrow. I think you have to be very careful about taking, and I say this as somebody who's deployed Anycast a few times, and I know that it's a lot more complicated than you can summarize in 6 recommendations.
Thanks for your feedback. I mean, of course, there's a lot of details in here.
If this was more like a literature review of Anycast-related stuff, published to a routing audience about academic insights into Anycast routing, I think that would be it would be a lot easier to understand what the draft was for. Because as it stands, it's not that I just disagree with the word recommendation. I think whatever you call it, these are too broad, and you're presenting them as something that's true across the board, and I don't think that's right.
I think sorry.
Yeah, I think you've got a good high-level discussion going, but I think drilling down into the details, that's good feedback for you, but also drilling down in the details can go to the list or to the bar. Although it's a little early for that.
Peter Koch-Dienig, I'm one of the many ex officio historians of the working group. Well, I hate to do this, but 15 years ago, so Lisha Zhang and her team had a draft out on TTLs, and they came, based on an academic paper, peer-reviewed, and so on and so forth, came basically to a similar conclusion that you presented here. It turned out that the working group couldn't agree on this because there are multiple considerations that kick in when it comes to TTLs in particular. So if at all, I'd recommend in that case to drop this topic from the list of issues that you cover in the document. Because, for example, in the previous session, we had someone having good reasons maybe to argue for shorter TTLs in certain circumstances. That said, TTLs are not necessarily a consideration for authoritative server operators. They are considerations for people designing the content, that is zone maintainers, then that might be a different audience. However, what Liman said, what Joe said, I'm all in favor of making these academic papers accessible, more accessible to operators by way of literature survey, like Joe said. But I also don't fully agree that the papers should result in recommendations, the observations, and that, for that matter, the selection of papers could benefit from a bit more diversity in contributors compared to what we have today. So different opinions would be good to get the full spectrum. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you, Gio. So, so the action point for us or for the working group was call. Is it ready? Should we go for a call for adoption? I think first we should go for more discussion on the mailing list. There's interest in the subject, but the opinions are, well, we need some discussion on the mailing list and then we go further. Thank you.
Yeah, I'd
Thank
just
you
like
all.
to thank everybody for the feedback and for reading this draft. Thanks a lot.
Thanks. Go. We didn't have a social this in this IETF, but this is how many people will feel like in a regular social, maybe in the morning. Okay, please go ahead.
Yes.
This is how everyone feels by Friday morning.
Yeah, yeah. Social and no social. So, DNS cookies are a measurement against amplification text. The kind where a botnet is used to let bots send a small query to a name server, which would result in a large answer. And because their source IP addresses are spoofed, and the source IP address is the IP address of the victim will get all the large answers. So the cookies are there to have a relationship between a query sender and a query replier. And to make it work, everything needs to do the DNS cookies. You cannot have one authoritative server in a set of authoritative servers not doing DNS cookies. And also resolver needs to do DNS cookies to benefit from this. And so multi-vendor cooperation is desirable. So this is, I just described it basically. Client, a query sending name server, which is usually a resolver, creates a client cookie from the IP address of itself and the IP address of the server it's sending to. The name server, the authoritative server, mostly derives from the client cookie and the client IP address and some secret. The server cookie returns that to the client, and then next time the client sends along the server cookie with its client cookie, and the server can recognize its own cookie because it can recalculate it from the client. And then when it receives a valid server cookie, it knows I had interaction with this client, so its source IP address is not spoofed, so I can serve it large answers or not do response rate limiting. So when you have DNS name servers in a Anycast set, then it's important that the server cookies that are created by one server are recognized or can be verified by the other server. Otherwise, the whole effect of cookies is gone. And so there was this first implementation of cookies in Bind. And there was a second implementation of DNS cookies in NOT, and they didn't match. So that was unfortunate for a few people that deployed DNS cookies. So Andre and I submitted a draft to deal with this, to come with a single way to create server cookies. And at a hackathon, I participated with Witold and Peter Lexis, and we made a interoperable server cookie implementation from this draft that works with bind, not, PowerDNS, NSD, and Unbound. And so the draft was just perhaps a sketch on how to do it. I think the most important thing to take from this is that we managed to make it interoperable with the vendors so quickly in a single hackathon. Donald Eastlake and Mark Andrews also created a draft how to create server cookies to deal with this problem. Only just before the submission deadline, didn't submit it yet. So we had a meeting with them yesterday and decided to merge them. So far what came out of this was so in our initial draft we had multiple algorithms, but from discussion with Donald, we decided to have a single table for IANA subregistry, DNS server cookie versions in the DNS registry that just says this is this version of how to make server cookies, and the current version in our draft uses zip hash and creates a cookie with this length. Things that we still need to do is to think about and write down how to do server secret rollovers and how to do it regularly. Implementation advice on how to do that smoothly. And appendix with test factors. So because we had multiple algorithms initially in our draft, it's now called DNS cookies algorithms. I think since we now have just one single algorithm and one single version, it's better to rename the draft as well. Oh, that's it.
Paul Hoffman, why did you choose SIP hash, given that it's like not at all standard and is brand new and pretty much isn't in many of the crypto libraries yet? I mean, it will be. It's not like obscure, but it's newer than anything, and it's faster by a bit. But why pick something like that?
I think Andre would like to respond on that.
I can answer that. This is Andre at IC. Well, the SIP hash was chosen because it's a good fit, and it's, even though it's a new, it's already used everywhere for collision resistance. If you look at it's everywhere. It's in all programming languages you use. The SIP hash is used for collision resistance. So even though it's new, it's a very good fit.
So can I, Benno Overeinde. No heads. Is it already also in the standard libraries, or the code is available so you can compile it with your?
Well, the code, there's a reference implementation from the authors. There's multiple other implementations, and OpenSSL 111 has it.
Okay.
I'm not sure about other crypto libraries, but the recent OpenSSL has the algorithm.
Okay.
Oh, even though the API is the standard OpenSSL API, so it's cryptic.
Thanks.
Yeah, also since every answer to a query needs a cookie, you need something that is really fast. So the initial RFC, the existing DNS cookie RFC suggests SHA, but that's just too slow. Better would be AES or SIP hash is a really good fit.
Hi, Peter Lexis, PowerDNS. Small follow-up to what Andre said. The reference implementation is license CC0, so it's public domain.
Okay. Okay. We wanted to go for fast track now, but I think it really solves an operational problem. We had an operational problem, so we will send out a call for adoption as a working group activity, document, draft, later on the mailing list, but I do see, I think in the room, positive vibes. I think positive in accepting this work as a
Yeah, I think the most important thing is that all the vendors cooperated and synchronized on this, but the form of how to exactly create a server cookie is also under discussion right now. For example, Witold has some ideas about it.
Warren Kamari, quick note. We should probably make sure that if we do adopt it, we make sure that the various people in the security groups actually, you know, get told so they can come along and have a look.
That's a good point. Thank you very much. Thank you.
I think we're back on time.
Yeah,
So don't let me run long.
Okay. Okay. We're perfect on time. Yeah. Okay, thank you.
So, hi, I'm Suzanne Wolf, and usually I sit over there as co-chair of DNSOP, but at the moment, no hats. I'm also in a few hours, ex-member of the IAB, also a hat flung away. But I wrote this draft, which I didn't do a lot to draw attention to, and sure enough, it didn't get much. So the purpose here is to get people to read the draft and comment and hopefully make it a better work. Subject is RFC 6761 and special use names. We are not here to recap the history. Again, well, to fight over the history. This is my personal view of the broad outlines of what happened and isn't the most important thing here. But since it was several years ago, we sort of need to RFC 6761 establishes a registry for domain names that are to be treated as special and outside of the DNS. It requires that the use of this proposed special use name be described along certain axes, but mostly those focus on how the name interacts with the DNS. There are some broader architectural questions and protocol questions that are not addressed at all. This was in the interest of providing flexibility, but it also means that it can be hard to apply. And the registry policy includes IESG judgment. The boilerplate on the registry is standards action and IESG approval, which again provides for flexibility, but also provides for challenges in consistency and clarity. DNSOP actually agreed earlier, a few years ago, to discuss special use names broadly. We got some decent work out of it. We got some insight out of it. RFC 8244, special use domain names problem statement. 7686, .onion. There was some discussion, although not a lot of conclusion of the impact. There is a liaison between the IETF and ICANN. And there was some discussion about how impacts on that and refinements to that. And after we had gone as far as we could as DNSOP to sort of study the parameters of the challenges here, we asked for next steps from the ISG. What do you need further from us? And at this point, it seems like the question that it would be useful for us to focus on is how should the ISG and the IETF apply the notions in RFC 6761. Regardless of the drama around the edges of these questions, it seems to happen and will continue to happen that IETF working groups sometimes need special use names in their protocols. And there are real questions, there are protocol and architecture relevant questions around how do you specify such names? How do you pick a string? How do you decide what you need in the context of making a protocol work? In addition, 6761 allows for uses outside of the IETF standards process in a sense. The boundaries are a little bit unclear. It's also the case that there would be a need to coordinate under certain circumstances with ICANN, just as we would with an SDO that overlapped IETF responsibility for certain protocols or registries. In a case, for instance, where the proponents feel a string might have to be delegated as a TLD for the protocol to work properly, a situation that has come under discussion in several cases, the IETF cannot do that. It also may be that the assurance could be required for the string, that the string won't be delegated as a TLD to avoid name collisions and for a protocol to work properly. And again, the IETF is not in a position to speak for another organization regarding what it will do with its responsibilities. You know, this is the kind of thing that arises in liaison and inter-organizational relationships all the time. So what the draft attempts to do, rather than boil the ocean of what should all of these abstract questions resolve to, tries to provide some specific advice, some specific guidance, primarily to the IETF community about how to use this notion of special use names in protocols to be developed in the IETF. The intention is that the advice might be more broadly applicable, but the primary focus is here in our backyard. It acknowledges that needing that having a case where you need a TLD can be really difficult. It makes things harder. And that names elsewhere in the hierarchy of domain names are going to work for protocol purposes most of the time. We're suggesting, I'm suggesting that the IETF working groups, you need to think about if you're allocating domain names as part of your protocol or assuming certain behavior around domain names in your protocol, you think about what characteristics they need to what the names need to have. Are they going to be human visible? If not, it doesn't matter if the string is pronounceable, for instance. Think hard about whether a special use name actually helps. We've seen discussions and barroom arguments about having that it might actually be a better protocol design without them. It can be an easy solution, but it's not necessarily a good one. And again, try not to need a TLD just because it's so much more work than a name elsewhere in the namespace if you're talking about an IETF protocol, an IETF activity. Now, as to what happens to this from here, we've had an informal request, and Warren can speak to it in any more detail if it's appropriate. Again, the ISG is looking for guidance. They would like to have an IETF consensus document, which may or may not formally update 6761, but the intention is to provide guidance for IETF working groups and possibly to non-IETF proponents of special use name reservations. As a second order goal, it seems like a good idea to avoid each request for a special use name going to DNSOP for ad hoc review, since folks here are not necessarily going to be experts on the protocols that created the requirement for a special use name or the characteristics of that protocol's use. Requests can burn up a lot of time and cycles, and we always have a lot of work to do in the working group on other topics. And it just seems appealing from the engineering point of view that we could reuse some of this challenging and painful experience we've had. There's another issue that we discovered in the course of earlier discussions about this that could be rolled into this document, having to do with the IAB and .ARPA, RFC 3172. For instance, it turned out that the way that a certain need in HomeNet was resolved for HRPC was that home.arpa was delegated as a special use name. And that required action by the IAB under RFC 3172. It requires standards action and specific review of IANA considerations. And it's one of the things that we could do is update RFC 3172 to allow the IAB to act in a slightly wider set of cases if that's what we want. It's a thing to consider. So next steps, some review. What considerations are missing from the draft? There's got to be more advice that we as the people that understand DNS can give other activities in the IETF about how to pick domain names and interact with DNS. We can go ahead and update 3172 or not. Currently, there's an IETF standards track RFC required for the IAB to act, but some of the pressure for special use names is coming from outside of the IETF. Doesn't make sense to say that under certain circumstances, which we would specify, a delegation in .ARPA is available outside of standards action. What about .alt, which DNSOP spent some time on and couldn't quite get to closure on? Should there be a reserved name sandbox for people to do ad hoc allocations of reservations? Should it be designated by the IETF? Do we need to propose some new mechanism for coordination around the possibility that there will be a compelling need for a special use TLD at some point? I don't think it requires new process. We have a liaison relationship. We have a good history of the IETF's liaison relationships working out reasonably well. But again, it's something to discuss. Do we adopt it as DNSOP? Go for it. Warren is jumping out of his shoes.
Would you mind going back to slide 5? Sorry, Warren Kamari. So I'm sure everyone here remembers the .onion discussions, and they were long and painful. And it would be really, really, really nice if we could avoid having those sort of discussions again. So I know that the working group's really tired of this topic, but it would be great if we could, work on it again, spend some time getting some sort of closure. So in the future, there is some guidance and we don't have to sort of start the process again and be like, what did we do last time? So yeah, I'd really encourage us to work on it, whether it happens in DNSOP or somewhere else. I think it's a problem we definitely need to solve, and thank you for writing it.
I really want to reuse some of that extremely painful experience.
Jim, I think.
I can use this mic.
All right, we're alternating microphones. Fine.
Okay.
You got
All you see
microphone, please?
I'm hiding behind all these very tall people in the row in front. Sorry about that. Jim Reed, a couple of comments. I think the question about not having the DNSOP working group do the review of these proposals for new special use names is a good one, but I do think we need some kind of review process to be part of this mess, to put it politely. Maybe something that an expert review panel could be convened to deal with that rather than confront the whole of the working group. But I do think we need to have some kind of broad perspective and understanding in case someone's asking for a special label that's already being used, or there's something already similar to the use of that particular new label elsewhere in the DNS. So that kind of visibility would be useful to try and manage some of those elements. Secondly, I do think we probably need to think more about the liaison with ICANN. And one thing that concerns me with the whole special use name thing is the potential in the future, if ICANN in its infinite wisdom decides to create new TLDs, is that we have people doing forum shopping and double dipping. Or perhaps someone comes to the IETF to try and subvert an application for a new DLT that's been submitted into the ICANN process. And we must have, I think we're going to have some language around that. I don't know what it would be, but we have to be aware of that as a distinct possibility. It didn't happen last round, but I think it might well happen the next time, especially when people are unhappy that certain strings were rejected as part of the ICANN process. And I think some people that were trying to those particular things will now come to the IETF and say, hey, ICANN's turned us down. Now the IETF, we've written an internet draft, give us a TLD.
Just as a point of order, we only have a couple minutes, so
closing the line and point of order. We do have 4 or 5 minutes for discussion on the mic.
Okay, Paolo, I just wanted to make one point of clarification in the recap of what we did. I think that one bullet point I was definitely missing is that we froze the use of 6761 and said we're not considering any new domain names, and that actually selectively left out some names. So it actually opened us up to a really selective process where we did adopt .onion and didn't adopt some other ones. And so in that light, I think it's really important to say, if we do not update 6761, we must move it to historic.
I think part of the point, here is that we don't want, I'm not going to argue the history with you, like I said, but I think the perception that the process is arbitrary and subjective is exactly what we're trying to build away from. So you're right. Thank you. Back, Mike.
Christian Rothoff. As the person who started the whole thing, I guess. I wanted to briefly share my experience with what has happened now. I don't know if you've been at the DINRG group. Given that the group decided that we should not have the .GNU TLD, we have now released software that basically allows the user to use the root zone and overwrite any top-level domain as they choose, which has had basically the answer, do you need a new TLD? No, we could have just used a collision. And we've done usability studies, and the result has been spectacular. Users can no longer tell apart if they're using DNS or GNS, so the migration to a new protocol is much easier if you don't use a new TLD. So the usability has been greatly improved, and that would have been good advice to have been gotten early on. Thank you.
Wes Hardiker, ISI. I want to second Jim's notion that figuring out how to have this how to have the input from ICANN is critical importance and challenging at the same time. Second thing to the chairs, don't let this drop. Don't let, we paused way too long with this issue, and as hard as it is and as much people need to do expert review on it from multiple standards organizations, it's critical we solve this.
Peter Kochdinik, I think there's one recommendation missing, which is very important and which would call people to the right actions regarding 6761, 67, whatever. I even forgot the number. And that is 6761 does make the name special. It doesn't allocate you the name. So this is not the second way to get a TLD or a non-TLD or anything. Prior mistakes of application of the RFC notwithstanding. So if you have a name, you can declare it special by registering it in that particular registry, but it doesn't get you the name. Second, I doubt that DNSOP is the right venue for this. I don't have a better one. And when it comes to liaising with ICANN, the previous occasion showed that both organizations were happily conspiring together to avoid the problem. Now, the next one around is, and you mentioned it on the slides, Home Corp and Mail. And I could imagine interesting fireworks if I can just throw this over the fence to the IETF to say, well, we have a draft here, just register these as special so we can blame the IETF for blocking those names. And I'm not sure that the IETF, and especially the IETF leadership, would like to be in that position. At least I hope they don't want that.
Stefan Bartsmeyer. As it is written today, the draft, it's mostly recommendations for IETF developed protocols, such as don't try to reserve a TLD, like the thing which was done with .home at the beginning, but it doesn't solve what is the real problem, because inside the IETF there is not really any problem. The problem comes when people from the outside wants to register a name as a special, and there is no proper way to greet them and to direct them to something proper. We have not been able to reserve .alt, for instance, for them. So they will continue to reserve TLD because it's the right thing to do for them. And then we'll still have the problem on ICANN also, because when you say that we cannot force ICANN to lock TLD to prevent it from being delegated, we cannot, but we can talk to ICANN and say that this one is used in practice, and ICANN can do it by itself because ICANN decided not to delegate .home, .corp, .mail because they are actually used. So input from the IETF could be just one more input for the ICANN for this decision. But at this time, the draft for me is not really interesting. It doesn't solve really any problem because it gives advice for people who already know about it. The real problem is how to greet requests from outside.
Part of the attempt here is that there's sort of a taxonomy of different cases where there's inside the IETF and outside, as you're saying, and the other distinction that we end up making because of the interorganizational implications is single label name. I don't even like the term TLD because it's overloaded, but single label name or not. The other dimension is Are people asking for the name to be allocated? Sorry, they're asking for it to be allocated in the sense that they're either asking for it to be delegated in the DNS with specific behavior. For example, an unsigned TLD was what HomeNet was asking for at one point. Or is what the protocol and the proponents are asking for that the name not be instantiated in the DNS, just the collisions be avoided, just reserved so the collisions can be avoided. And to me, at least, these are distinct cases, and the document tries to discuss them accordingly. But if there are other approaches, or if that needs refinement, I think that's valuable feedback.
Okay.
So the question, I think we'll have to go to the chairs to discuss how to forward discussion on the list. We'll put Warren on the spot to consider what we've heard here also. But my real goal was just to get review for the document and get people who are not too traumatized to ever think about this subject again to help us do something constructive here within the cases that we can actually deal with. Thanks.
Thank you. One small remark, Warren? Small? Short.
Sorry.
I guess this is kind of related to my earlier thing. Would the working group be willing to please consider working on this, either specifically here or even just review the document? Please review it, send comments, plea for work here.
Yeah, thank you. Indeed. Stephen. This is a cross-working group presentation. No, sorry, not cross, but if for no working group. Sorry, this is
former failed working group cross presentation.
Thank you for the context and history here. I'm so new at the working group.
So hi, I'm Stephen. This is Alex. This is an idea of Alex's, basically. Next slide. So it's essentially looking again at the problem that DBound was trying to tackle, to try and see is there a small bit of that problem, smaller bit, that people might be willing to kind of tackle and then publish records. The idea basically is that if you have two related domains, that one of them can declare this relationship, basically asserting the relationship without, in this draft, giving any kind of strong semantics about that. And there's an extensibility mechanism that would allow you to later on say there's a particular tag value if you have some semantic that goes with the relationship. So for example, it shows that example.com is related to department example.com. So next slide. There was a 0.0 version of this that had kind of DKIM style use of TXT records and DKIM style signatures for doing some authentication. We got a bunch of comments on that on the dbound list, so we put out a 0.1 that kind of flips over and has optional signatures that are DNSSEC style and a new Aurora type, which I may have messed up because it's the first time I've written a draft that tries to define a new Aurora type. The signatures kind of provide, in a non-DNSSEC environment, they kind of provide some assurance that the declared relationship is more likely to be real than otherwise. It's not a very strong kind of guarantee. And I think the next slide is one Alex is going to talk to about use cases. So, yeah, there you go.
So I wanted to talk a little bit about the use cases. In my day job, I spend time doing anti-abuse and email. So in some of those analysis, we find that we can't always determine a relationship between two domains that appear to be related, and then sometimes we may need to err on the side of caution, and that doesn't always work out well for the end user. So it would be beneficial in our world to be able to say that yes, example.com is related to example.fr, for example. The marketing department may use an outside vendor. I work for a large company, sometimes without knowledge to the DNS team, the mail team, whatever else. They go outside and they create, whatever they feel like at whatever vendor they feel like. And then they don't understand why the mail doesn't go through. Creating new domains. For example, Uber.com decides they would like to launch a new service called Uber Eats. They might want to demonstrate a relationship. Companies buy companies all the time. You may want to, for some reason or another, show that sort of chain of authority, I guess. something more for Stephen, I think, is internet surveys and research, I suppose, being, I don't want to say map the web. It sounds kind of horrible when I say it like that, but yeah. And then something like was sort of on the first slide, example.fr and example.de. I don't know how common it is. I mean, I live in the States, so I don't know how common it is for a large brand here to say like McDonald's.com, McDonald's.fr, McDonald's.de, and how can I actually determine the relationships? We used to have not a lot of data, but there was data in Whois, and some of it was reliable, some of it was not, and that's been sort of going away, making our jobs even more difficult. So I'm hoping that something like this we can work toward to make it more obvious that these relationships or the link does exist. So.
Next slide.
Yeah. Oh, so there's a link to the name of the draft, and we've been having discussions on the debound list only because that seemed more appropriate, I suppose.
Well, I think we were told to.
So, yes,
some random AD told us to do that, so that's where the discussion is.
Brian Dixon. One of the things that I think is a concern is the difference between an explicit declaration of non-mapping versus an implicit lack of declaration, which can be interpreted either way. I think it would be very helpful to have the explicit declaration of mapping or also the explicit declaration of non-mapping, i.e. somebody can put a defensive record that says there's no other related zones.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
Alex Mayo from ICT.at. I'm concerned about two things, actually. For one, you gave a very vague definition of what the semantics of the relationship is, besides that this is somehow related. So I'm wondering how can the semantics of the protocol be clear when not even the relationship definition of what does this record actually mean is clear? So quite frankly, that would render it completely useless. And the other point is, there are like a couple of other mechanisms out there. I'm thinking about HTML-based meta tags, related pages, and something like that, redirects, whatever. So I wonder whether if you put something in the DNS like this, does it apply to each and every protocol, each and every future protocol? It's very opaque. Yeah.
Sure. I mean, I think it's fair comment, and I mean, there's a cesspit of semantics that you could get into, and we're trying to avoid it. Now, maybe that would work, maybe it wouldn't work. That's a good question, I think. But and right now we're trying to avoid that issue, but maybe that's feasible and maybe it isn't.
But I think if the semantics are not clearly defined, then it's essentially a useless indication.
You'd see. I mean, right now in the 0.1, it kind of says we're declaring a relationship but not defining the semantics, and there's a tag if you did want to define semantics for later in more specific ways.
I'm closing the queues. Okay, just go. Go on.
Dan had actually said Jabber.
Oh, this is one? Okay. And then somewhere in the middle or at the end?
Okay, I'll go. Thanks very much, Joe. Jim Reed, a couple of comments, Stephen. There's an interesting idea, but I'm not sure the DNS is a place for representing these kind of semantic relationships. I think the idea of being able to say these things are kind of equivalent is potentially useful and interesting, but as Alex was suggesting, it perhaps creates other potential problems further down the line. And we need to think a little bit more about that. But I'm still not all that convinced we should be putting that kind of semantic meaning into the DNS. The DNS is really essentially a lookup mechanism to retrieve some data about an object, and I'm not sure that kind of semantic meaning is appropriate for the DNS. And then the second question I would have for you is, how is your proposed record type any really different from DNAME?
So there was an extended discussion about the DNAME question on the debound list.
Right.
So
sorry, I haven't been following that list.
No, it's fine. Yeah, and some of it I didn't understand, so I'd point you at the list. And
okay, thank you.
So for timekeeping, we have about 5 minutes. So please give everyone the opportunity to ask a question, but be brief.
Joe Abley, PIR. I actually think the cesspool is fine. I think it's actually an advantage not to define exactly what it means, because, and I don't think a lookup mechanism. So this is why DNAME would actually change query behavior. We're not talking about that, because we find at PIR that when you try and cluster domains together to identify when you're doing business intelligence about the scope of a registry, for example. The mechanisms that you have to try and cluster these domains together are horribly messy. They're to do with who is data that's vaguely similar, or words that are common, or they're specific to the web because you have to scrape the web and you find out that they have things in common. And it's incredibly resource intensive to try and do and inaccurate. So I think this would be great if it existed, but my question is, what incentive does a domain name holder have to actually publish these records? If there was something like DKIM, where if you don't publish it, you don't deliver mail to Google, then that's a good incentive, right? It's like reverse DNS and V6. Nobody would do it at all if it wasn't for mail delivery to Google and places like Google with their similar policies. Is there any incentive here for anybody to ever publish these records?
I mean, I sort of would think so. I mean, again, I come from a large company, and so we do have, our marketing departments do things that make our lives very difficult. So they could, our DNS team could go back and say, we're going to work with you to make sure this is correctly attributed to our company, and then we'll work with you at some point later to make it really work the way it should. I mean, it seems like it'd be something for their operations to ease their lives, but I mean, ultimately, it's from the anti-abuse perspective. You know, if you want to try to create a new domain name and you don't have the time to say create a new reputation for that domain in terms of messaging reputation, you know, you can say, okay, look, this is linked to here. We are a legitimate domain that now is going to be associated with, for example, Uber Eats and Uber. I mean, I can't say it works the same way for all use cases, but in that case, I mean, I think there's some, you know, a good example of why it would be useful.
I think imagining that marketing departments who are already not following the rules would somehow choose to follow this one is a bit.
I'm not saying they would.
But I would encourage you to find something like an anti-abuse use case to provide some incentive, because it would be really good if it existed.
Brief questions and brief answers, please.
Matt Poundstead. This actually ties back a little bit to what Joe said, but I'm having a hard time wrapping my head around the use cases. You mentioned a lot of them, but when I look at the incentives for a lot of those use cases, they all seem to boil back to anti-abuse and potential and boil back to the interpretation by anti-abuse researchers. So if that actually is the real single use case, then it might be better just to say that. And if those other use cases have other motivations why people might want to use them for that, maybe say that too. Because right now I'm having a hard time understanding how it's useful in those other cases. And when I look at the anti-abuse situation, I start to wonder what the possible interpretations of the absence of the records could mean. And that starts to feel like it could be kind of messy. And so that might be a suggestion towards actually making it a little more semantically meaningful rather than less. Yeah.
Thank you. Next.
John Redock, my quick question about directionality in the draft. I know you say it's unidirectional. Has any thought been given to recommendations around best practices to which direction it should be? Should the email marketing provider add its customers, the other way around? Either way, those lists can get real big real fast. And I'm just wondering what thought has been given to that. And also once you set up the directionality, how do you make sure it's gone on both ends when the relationship's over? Sorry.
I mean, from my perspective, it seems like the sort of the largest or most well-known domain wins, but maybe that's not really how it works. So, I mean, maybe instead of, I don't know if there's an alphabet.com, but that seems less well-known than google.com.
Sure.
So, but you would think ultimately if alphabet.com is actually the real parent of Google, that's where it should kind of feed up through. But it's really the relationship that you want to declare, I suppose.
Right. Some recommendations around best practices would be good.
Okay. And also, please, on the mailing list.
This is Murray, former co-chair of DBound. I'm totally fine with you using my mailing list because we never did anything useful with it anyway. So, again, he sort of took half my point. You should probably say something about what happens when you find a unidirectional assertion, because that may be meaningless. It might even be a threat. Like, I'm claiming association with your domain to try to gain some benefit. Maybe what has to happen is I have to go to you and get some confirmation that the opposite is also true. So that doesn't seem to be addressed in there at all.
Alex, this is Sam Weiler. What I heard you say as you went through the use cases was, this is a way for, what if I want to know if these two domains are related? I think the real question comes when
what does a piece of code do when it sees one of these? I think that's why your use cases are not fleshed out enough. Part two, someone at the mic said that they weren't sure if DNS was the right place for this. I will draw everyone's attention to a proposal from Mike West called First Party Sets that involves JSON objects served over HTTPS. I don't know if that's the right way either, but it is a different way and may have a differently scoped set of use cases than what you're looking at. Part three, this signing with straight authenticated keys thing is crazy.
Okay, thank you. So Warren Kamari, Google, I'll try and keep it really short. So I'm not entirely sure that this should be in the DNS, but if it is, I would like to be able to have it so that I can say google.com is the same as google.de, not at lookup time, but so that people who are doing abuse stuff can have a look and draw some correlation. What I'd like to be able to do even more is be able to say in google.com, google.bd is not a sort of Google property, so I can sort of disavow a bunch of domain names. And I think that would be even more useful than we able to say what ones are the same. So.
Okay. Dan York, employed by the Internet Society, but not speaking for them. So first I want to say thanks for bringing this draft here. I think it's good to have, we've often talked about wanting to have people bring operational, usage of DNS and where you're seeing issues with it, bring it here. So thank you for writing this and bringing it here. I guess I would just have two comments. One, you mentioned that you would find it useful for your work and things. Have you spoken to other vendors or software folks or people who might implement this in terms of, where I'm going is I think it would be useful to talk to people who might be consumers of this and find out, would they implement it? And that kind of thing, and see whether that would be, oh, Murray's saying, okay. So, so I think that would be something that would be useful to have and to be able to do that, so that maybe a hackathon or something could be looking at some of those kind of things or something. The other part is a comment in here. I think I'm a little concerned with the trust. By the way, I'm from one of those communications departments that does that kind of stuff. And, this would be kind of cool. We could use this in a couple places. But one question is, what prevents some less ethical marketing folks or somebody from claiming that they're really associated with another domain? I might be able to say that, hey, my domain is associated with google.com or something like that. So trust me, I'm important. So I think that's the one little thing that, because not all my communications colleagues are ethical.
Yeah, I guess that's where that's where the crazy signature thing is trying to help. But
Murray, please. Yeah.
Yes. Murray again, also not employed by or paid by ISOC. I think this possibly has applications in the DMARC space as well, because we tried to, we wanted to capitalize on debound and it didn't work. So it's possible that this could be an add-on to that somehow. So there's maybe a possible use case.
Okay. Thank you. So your question further, review, discussion on debound mailing list and...
Yep. Questions or comments there or to us or whatever.
Okay.
Thanks.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Okay. Then it's, well, thank you. The final agenda point here. Yeah, you will go through the slides.
Oh no, blue sheets. Anybody not signed the blue sheets?
Right.
Just raise their hand.
Okay. So who's up for a short introduction?
Only myself.
No. Just the historical. So we had a discussion on a name in Bangkok. Tim prepared, well, the problem space is well known. I think we don't have to go into this, also given time. There was the C name, A name discussion, HTTP. The chairs felt it was kind of all the different proposals held themselves or together were in a deadlock. So we want to separate these discussions. So we can have the HTTP discussion, we can have the C name discussion if we still want to pursue, but don't let us stop the A name discussion. Actually, that's why we're here now. Also want to point out, a draft written by Dan York about all the users or the web publisher perspective. Have a read of it. And actually, given time, I want to give the floor to you, actually, Matthijs. Matthijs will give, well, speak for yourself, actually, about the A-name draft status and.
Okay, sorry. Ja, dat is wel goed. Okay, so I think I'm here because I made some confusion on the mic on Tuesday. There I said that it might be a good idea to have a separate direction with A-name, to have a different scope, a smaller scope, so we can make more progress. That caused some reaction on the mailing list, so I thought maybe it would be a good idea to get this to the working group. Benno covered a little bit of a quick history, like this is done by DNS providers. This is not going away. So A-name draft was written by Evan and Peter, and people came along to that, lots of discussion, made a very complex solution in the -01 version. And then, yeah, we thought that we're on a bad path here. So there was a complete rewrite. That's the -02 version that Tony Finch did. To me, that is a very nice document. All the complexity has gone away. It doesn't rely on resolver upgrades. And got a lot of feedback on the mailing list. After that, it went a little bit silent. So how do we proceed with A-name is basically the thing. I went on the list and looked at the discussion and got a little bit of requirements out of that. So the A-name stuff should fully support offline DNSSEC. Does not require server changes except for the R type. Needs to work with resolvers that don't do A-name, like that never were implemented. The resolution should not be required in the server. It should be possible, but is not a requirement and must be working in a multi-provisioner model. I think the 02 version does that. So basically, I think there are two ways to go forward. One is iterate on the current draft, and please make sure that on the discussions focus on what's in there and notice that it actually has the requirements that I just listed. Or we can reduce the scope and just get rid of all the resolver stuff, processing and secondary server processing, with the idea that we can come to reach to a document faster, like there's less contentious stuff, there's reduced scope, or we can iterate on the current draft. I'm fine with both. I would like to hear what the working group thinks about that.
The queues are open.
I like the current draft as is. I would like to implement it. Willem Torop, by the way, in Elnet Labs.
Brian Dixon, GoDaddy. I've commented extensively on the lists, and one of the main issues with any of the current drafts are the requirements for authority servers to act in a way that previously only recursives needed to, which is fetching and storing and updating the targets of A-name. And that does not scale for authority servers, especially large ones. So I don't speak for my employer, GoDaddy, but it's a major concern that we clearly have an interest in not having problems that don't scale. It's basically an existential threat. So it hasn't been addressed adequately by the draft, and I don't think it can be due to the requirement for the fetching and updating of records, other than the specific local ones. So I think it needs to be addressed in a different way, in a different place. But That's my analysis and observation, and I think it needs to be strongly considered.
And when you say in service, do you mean the whole thing, or like in the name server itself, like in the implementation?
In the authority servers, there's a whole bunch of different aspects of this, one of which is it interferes with GeoIP, because for at least our implementations, the authority servers for a given zone are centralized and pushed out to Anycast locations. They're not differentiated. So querying an authority server, returning a record, the sibling record is not going to be geo-differentiated. And that breaks all of the GeoIP stuff that the A-name targets are expecting. It just doesn't work. And there's no way to make it work. The second aspect of that is scale. Recursives scale by query. Authorities scale by the number of zones. So if you look at the long tail, the issue is you're now placing recursive level transaction requirements on, it changes the business model, and it does so in a very negative way, because typically the long tail of zones don't see query load. There's no way to recoup the costs of doing what A-name requires.
So to your last comment, I think indeed it would be nice that the document or a successor document would at least have the resolver A-name processing to improve and make the A-name resolution better for the client. To your first point, GeoIP, yes, that's a different thing. If you're going to do tailored responses, then the document doesn't work, but that's the same with like DNSSEC. With GeoIP, you're also not doing offline signing. You are required to do online signing because you're doing tailored responses. The same is true for A-name resolution. So if you want to do A-name and GeoIP, you have to implement it sort of in your secondary server, and that will scale actually. And in the draft, it doesn't prevent you from doing that either. You just have to bend a little bit the rules like those providers do.
And I would have to take, yeah, go ahead.
Okay, yeah, sorry about that. Thank you. I'm closing the line.
Yeah, Shane Kerr.
Sorry, Brian, I was closing the line. No. Well, otherwise
I'll let you argue when you get
Otherwise,
to
I
the
have
end.
to. Sorry, no. Otherwise, I have to interrupt you during a discussion, and I don't like to do that either. I close the line.
So just very quickly, my understanding is the reason this draft exists is because people have implemented things almost exactly like this. So the claims that it won't scale are just false. I mean, we do this. Other large authoritative servers do this. So it does scale.
Yeah, so I'm sort of going to repeat that. Anecdotal evidence that this sort of thing does work. I implemented, or was involved in implementing this with for a large DNS operator with 3.7 million zones. We ended up having to do ramp up and back off algorithms such that the more often we witnessed a target change, the more often we queried it to see if it had changed. In order for the ones that were very stable, we could essentially ignore them. That helped it work really well. But yeah, it works. We did testing. Although we never ran this in production, we did testing with and simulations with up to 10 million domains, and that was fine. So, yeah, I don't particularly see that as an issue.
Peter Paciek, CZNIC, as was mentioned, it just works in the practice and it's implemented. So I propose to cut it into two documents. First one, just specifying how you do zone transfer and how do you resolving part, and don't specify where you should do it. So it can be in the provisioning system or in the off or in anywhere you want in your particular implementation. And I think that this would go a long way because it would allow people who use this already in existing deployments like Dyn and whatever to have more than one provider, because once we have the zone transfer specified, you can just move or use two providers and so on. And then if this actually works and gets implemented by these big guys who offer this service now, we can go and work on the second document, which could say, okay, how, if I'm DNS software developer, how should I implement this in my code?
Only one here. I don't buy that it will break GDNS because we just finished a name, GDNS a name that with our provider that actually also resolves or propagates EDNS over multiple A-name records, and we verified it last night, and it works just fine. I'd really not buy it would somehow break it.
So just one comment, which was just from the high level, the statement that what is currently being offered is being done by DNS providers. I think it's a mischaracterization. It's being offered by vertical integration suppliers that do both authoritative and recursive, or do DNS plus web hosting or similar kinds of content related stuff. So it's different.
Matthew, very short comment on this.
No.
Okay, thank you for the shortness. Thank you. So you can summarize if you want.
No, I'll let it. You do it.
Ooh. No, but so I heard a couple of things here. I think of course we take it to the mailing list, and also the discussion on one or two documents. So it might be for the process easier to proceed with 2 documents, but I definitely want to hear that a little bit more on the mailing list, and the chairs will also sit together with you and with the other stakeholders, the pen holders of the document, how to proceed. Tim, any other questions remarks you want to make here as a stakeholder, as the operator?
I think Brian's incorrect as to who does this. I think, thank you, Matthias, for this. I think one document is good. We can scope it down and not put a second document out, which will just sort of confuse people initially, right? So but yeah, we'll sit down and I think we'll sort this out.
Personally, also, I heard little people, not so many comments that say, "Oh, you really have to split it." I think we should iterate on the current draft.
I think we should iterate it, and this scales. Everybody does it now, right? All the vendors do it. Everybody does it. So yeah, I don't see that as a problem either. Go ahead.
So let me just relay a comment on that. Tony Finch, who's been involved with this, asked, I'd like more descriptions on the list from vendors on how they do a name. So to the comment that people are saying they already do this and scale this, I think Tony's sort of saying why, and not realizing the time, send to list. And likewise, for people who would say, who are in here saying the scales and stuff, would they support this would be useful.
Okay. Tim Wasinski, Tony, thank you. Of course, thank you for all this. I've talked with the vendors about this. Each vendor feels their secret sauce is tastier than the other vendor's secret sauce, and they don't like to share. But if we can find some of that, that would be great. But that's my experience talking with them under NDA, not actually getting solid answers. So, vendor A is much tastier than vendor B sort of thing. So, but a useful idea, Tony. Thank you.
The search for common ground continues.
Thank you. Yeah. Thank you, Matthijs. Thank you. We're in time, kind of, 3 minutes. And there's no need to leave the room because there's debrief afterwards here. So just stay around.
But whoever has the clipboards, please bring the blue sheets so we can take them to the secretariat. Thank you. All righty.
All right.